Hello again, Steve here. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the book by George Orwell, 1984. And the first question might be as to what does this have to do with our Inner Genie project, our Inner Genie journeys, Inner Genie journeys. I would say it has a lot to do with an examination, a fictional examination of human nature. And the more we can understand human nature, we can more understand ourselves. And or the lack of human nature, the lack of humanity, because this sort of tendency to become very inhuman, which is what 1984 is partly about, but it's partly about being very human. The more we can understand that, the more we can examine brilliant minds, which Orwell obviously was, the better off we're going to be, because it's like when we have a very complicated machine, the more we can understand about that machine, the better off we can be in terms of somebody who can drive that machine. So yeah, I started out, I had heard snippets and I had gotten the gist of 1984 many times, but I figured I'd start out with Animal Farm, and Animal Farm it's very entertaining for sure, and it's a brilliant examination also of how it is that people go down the wrong path for their emancipation. And what I saw 1984 as is a sequel to Animal Farm, although I don't know in which order they were written. But for me, it's a sequel because at the end of 1984, or at the end of the Animal Farm, the pigs, who were the ones who were running the farm by then, who were more equal than others. Some animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others is a line that came out of there. At the end, they became indistinguishable from human. So, and then you see, I went straight into 1984, which is about the dystopian nature that humanity can plunge itself into. And what's interesting about this, you can easily download it on Audible or get an ebook or whatever, but I would recommend this to anybody. And I would recommend parents to talk about this with your children. I don't know if 1984 certainly is, I don't think is a good idea for children to read it. It's quite gory at the end, although Animal Farm certainly would be a good discussion to have. But what's interesting about this mostly is I was talking to a guy today. It's a guy I sort of work with sometimes, remotely anyway. He's in his, I would say, late 60s, so we're going back to the 60s is when he would have been in school. And I asked him about this book because something came up to do remotely with totalitarianism and corporatism or something like that. And I asked him if he'd ever read the book Animal Farm, 1984 by George Orwell. He said, "Oh yeah, we read that in school." In school. Interestingly enough, because I was thinking while I was going through these books that the information contained in here, if this was somehow disseminated into the minds of children and talked about with parents who could equally talk about it, we wouldn't have the problems we're having in the world. People would think rightly, because 1984 is a book about how a system, a society, does whatever it can. Like, the ends of that society is to stop people from thinking, to gain power. If you can think, you went through a process to de-think you, or whatever. Like it's extremely Orwellian, shall I say. So if kids could read this, if kids could know about this sort of thing, they would be encouraged to think. And if we could think in the world, we'd have a lot freer society for sure. But yeah, I thought this was an example of how society has changed. And here was a guy who's from England originally, he grew up in England, who read 1984 in school. This is amazing. Of course, it was written in 1948, I believe, by George Orwell. So if he was in school in the late 60s, would have been a 20-year-old. It was already wildly popular at the time. But I can't imagine today a school that's run, I'll say it again, mostly by women who are typically nervous and who go for authoritarian states, right? In his time, most of the teachers, a lot of the teachers would have been men, and they were still quite rationally men. Many of them were masculine men at the time. And George Orwell's 1984 was wildly popular. They read that in school. Is it any wonder that those men are more manly, right? Is it any wonder why they're more skeptical of communism? I was working with another guy recently I don't find him to be the most informed guy in the world, but he's an older guy. He's in his early 60s, I think. Once again, grew up in England. And he was talking about how he was disappointed by a certain campsite that had all kinds of rules because of COVID-19 and so on. And he referred to them as communists. I thought that was really interesting. It just came fluidly out of him. Because he grew up in a time, in the 60s and so on, when communists was synonymous with really bad people, like people who wanted to micromanage your life. Whereas today, for the younger people, communism is seen as freedom, right? So, and if you read 1984, you'll see how in a society that has gone down the communist, socialist leg very far, everything's flipped on its head. You know, freedom is tyranny, and tyranny is freedom, and thinking is evil, and sex is evil, and everything that's natural basically is evil, and it's completely turned upside down. It's quite amazing. So yeah, I think this does help when we learn to think straight, and when we can delve into the minds and dive into the minds of very intelligent people who were able to see things for what they were. I mean, Orwell here is a savant. I mean, there's so many Orwell-isms in our society. We even say that's very Orwellian. You know, that's coming straight out of some people are more equal than others. Memory hold and doublethink and all these sorts of terms come straight out of 1984 and Animal Farm. So I think there's a lot we can learn from this. I say anybody who's interested in freedom and anybody who's interested in being more in charge of themselves and being able to think straightly, both of those books could be very high up on the to read list or to review list for sure. So, yeah. See if you're getting great chatting. If you like what I'm doing, please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll talk again soon. Bye for now.